Hello, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about Demian by Hermann Hesse. Demian is probably best known as a coming-of-age novel. It's a book that many teenagers read, and one that's often recommended to young readers. I'm sure most of you have at least heard of it. Let's start with the story. The main character is a boy named Sinclair. Sinclair is a very ordinary boy. But one day, he unexpectedly meets a slightly rough, delinquent boy named Cromer. At first, they simply hang out together. Cromer is portrayed as being a year or two older than Sinclair. Wanting to impress him, Sinclair starts exaggerating. He says things like, "I've done this before. I've even stolen things. I've done all kinds of stuff." His desire to look like a hero gets the better of him, and he ends up bragging. Cromer immediately picks up on it. "Wait, you stole something? Then I guess I should tell the man who owns it. He's looking for the thief right now. If I tell him it was you, I could even collect the reward. Let's say it's about $2,000. I should go tell him right away." Hearing that, Sinclair is terrified. He begs Cromer not to tell anyone. "Please don't say anything. If this gets out, I'm in serious trouble." He desperately asks Cromer to keep it a secret. But Cromer has a condition. "Then bring me some money." So Sinclair breaks open his piggy bank and gives him everything he has. But Cromer isn't satisfied. "This isn't nearly enough. Maybe I should just tell the owner after all." And with that, he keeps threatening Sinclair. Sinclair continues handing over money, and before long, he's pulled into this dark world of fear and blackmail. Then, one day, a new student named Demian transfers to Sinclair's school. Like Cromer, Demian is also about a year or two older than Sinclair. At first, Sinclair doesn't pay much attention to him. But interestingly, it's Demian who takes an interest in Sinclair. One day, Sinclair notices Demian standing in front of his house, doing something. When he looks closer, he sees that Demian is sketching a bird he spotted nearby. Sinclair asks him what he's doing. Demian explains that he's interested in things like drawing birds. Sinclair isn't particularly eager to talk. But on the walk home from school, Demian keeps striking up conversations with him. Then one day, Demian tells Sinclair the story of Cain and Abel. Now, here's the story of Cain and Abel. It comes from the book of Genesis in the Bible. According to the Bible, the very first humans were Adam and Eve. Their two sons were Cain and Abel. Cain was the older brother, and Abel was the younger. Cain was a farmer, while Abel was a shepherd. One day, they each offered a sacrifice to God. Since Cain was a farmer, he offered crops from his harvest. Abel, being a shepherd, offered one of his sheep. But something unexpected happened. God did not accept Cain's offering. Instead, he accepted only Abel's. People sometimes joke about this and say, "What, was God a meat lover or something?" Of course, that's just a joke. When Cain saw that his offering had been rejected, his face changed with anger. Then God said to him, "Cain, your face doesn't look right. Sin is crouching at your door." God warned him, but Cain couldn't let go of his anger. He called his younger brother out into a field and killed him with a stone. Later, God asked him, "Where is your brother?" Cain replied, "Why do you keep asking me about my brother? Am I supposed to be his keeper?" Then God said, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." And he confronted Cain about what he had done. Realizing everything had been exposed, Cain pleaded, "If you banish me, people will kill me. Please give me some kind of protection." So God answered, "No one will kill you. I will place a mark on you. Anyone who sees that mark will not harm you." That is what we call the mark of Cain. But when Demian tells this story to Sinclair, he interprets it in a completely different way. He says, "Listen, Sinclair, Cain wasn't some pathetic criminal. He wasn't weak. The truly weak people were ordinary people. Cain was actually the strongest man of his time." According to Demian, wherever Cain went, those weak, insignificant people couldn't help but admire him, fear him, and tremble in his presence. But think about it. That's embarrassing, isn't it? So what did they do? They came up with a different explanation. Oh, we leave Cain alone not because we're afraid of him, but because God gave him a special mark. If it weren't for that mark, if we really wanted to, we could deal with him. It's only because of the mark of Cain that we can't touch him. In other words, maybe people invented that story simply to justify themselves. Maybe Cain wasn't a criminal at all. Maybe he was an extraordinarily powerful person, someone almost like a superhuman. That's how Demian interprets the story. Sinclair thinks, that's a pretty strange way to interpret it. He even asks his father about it. But his father tells him, no, that's not a good interpretation. Even so, Sinclair and Demian gradually become friends. Then one day, Demian notices something. You don't look so well. Is something bothering you? You can tell me. At first, Sinclair hesitates, but eventually he tells Demian about Cromer. And here's the embarrassing part. Sinclair completely breaks down and starts crying. Now, I think a lot of the men listening will understand this. Imagine you're already in middle school. A classmate is bullying you. You finally tell your friend about it, and you end up crying your eyes out. At that point, your pride feels completely shattered. The next time you see that friend, you almost want to avoid them out of embarrassment. That's exactly how Sinclair feels. Somehow, Demian steps in and takes care of the problem. After that, Cromer starts avoiding Sinclair. But Sinclair also feels awkward around Demian. Why? Because Demian saw him crying. He's so embarrassed that he starts avoiding Demian as well. Eventually, it's time to move on to the next stage of school. The two boys end up attending different schools. Sinclair leaves home and moves into a boarding school. That's where his period of wandering begins. He starts drinking. In fact, he drinks heavily. He loses interest in his classes and gradually falls into a reckless lifestyle. One day, while wandering around, he meets a girl who seems absolutely perfect. But shy as ever, Sinclair can't even bring himself to speak to her. Instead, he simply gives her the name Beatrice, after the character in Dante's Divine Comedy. He wonders, will I ever see her again? But he never does. So instead, he paints her portrait. But as he's painting, he notices something strange. Why does this keep turning into Demian's face? The story continues from there. Still feeling lost? Sinclair writes a letter to Demian. Eventually, a reply arrives. And this is where the famous passage about Abraxas appears. The note says, the bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Whoever would be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies toward God. That God's name is Abraxas. It's a mysterious message, and Sinclair isn't quite sure what to make of it. But after meeting Beatrice and receiving Demian's letter, he begins to regain his sense of purpose. Later, while taking a walk in his hometown, he hears the sound of a beautiful melody. Drawn by the music, he follows it to a church. There, he meets an organist named Pistorius. From that point on, Sinclair begins spending time with Pistorius. Through him, he's introduced to art, and by coincidence, Pistorius also happens to know about Abraxas. As Pistorius helps him explore these ideas, Sinclair gradually matures. But after some time, even Sinclair begins to feel that things have gone too far. He finally says, I've had enough of all these dreams and symbols. Can we talk about something more practical instead? He says it rather bluntly, and the relationship between the two ends on an awkward note. Later, by chance, Sinclair meets Demian's mother, Frau Eva. Meeting her gives him the feeling that he has finally found a spiritual guide, someone who can lead him. At the same time, Frau Eva fills an emotional and spiritual emptiness within him with her love and kindness. Sinclair is reunited with Demian as well. Demian has grown into an even more mature young man, and Sinclair himself continues to mature. The two spend their time talking about the future of Europe and the great changes that seem to be coming to the world. Then World War I breaks out, and both of them go off to war. Both Demian and Sinclair are wounded. Then, by chance, Sinclair looks beside him and sees Demian lying there. For the last time, Demian says to Sinclair, "The next time you face hardship, I may not be there beside you, but listen to the voice within yourself. When you do, you'll hear me. And my mother, Frau Eva, speaking to you." The next morning, when Sinclair wakes up, Demian is gone. And that's how the story ends. Now, after reading Demian, people often describe it as the story of Sinclair's growth. After all, Sinclair is the true protagonist. But what did you think? Did Sinclair really grow that much? I'm not so sure. To me, he simply feels like an ordinary person. An ordinary boy who goes through a rebellious phase, loses his way for a while, and then gradually pulls himself together. Is that really what true growth is? I don't think growth is something that happens once and is finished. I think it's an ongoing process. That's why I actually think Sinclair is still in a very precarious stage. His growth isn't complete. His real growth still lies ahead. In that sense, I see Demian as nothing more than the prologue to Sinclair's life. There's one more thing that's worth paying attention to. Hermann Hesse himself struggled with depression, and as I understand it, he received treatment from one of Carl Jung's students. Carl Jung believed in the idea of individuation, the process of becoming a whole person. Simply put, he believed that we all have different parts within ourselves. There's the ego, our conscious sense of self. There's the shadow, the dark, repressed side we'd rather not face. Then there is the feminine side of the psyche, which Jung called the anima in men and the animus in women. According to Jung, a person becomes whole only when all of these aspects are integrated. But individuation isn't something you achieve once and for all. It's an ongoing process, one that continues throughout life, almost like a spiral. The part that concerned me most about Sinclair was actually his memory of Cromer. Every time Sinclair is with Demian, the one subject he wants to avoid more than anything is what happened with Cromer, the moment when he broke down crying and begged Demian for help. For both of them, Cromer becomes a taboo subject, something they never talk about, and in the end, they never do bring it up. Cromer represents the one subject Sinclair wants to avoid more than anything. It's the part of himself he wants to suppress, his dark side, his shadow. And by the end of the novel, that shadow still hasn't been resolved. Even in the final moments of the story, Sinclair never truly comes to terms with it. If he had genuinely achieved individuation, if he had truly grown, then he should have been able to talk openly about Cromer. But he can't. There's another point I'd like to mention. At one point, Demian tells Sinclair, "You have the same mark that I do." But I don't see Demian as someone who has fully achieved individuation or as the perfect model of personal growth. To me, Demian simply represents strength. And what Demian hates most is weakness. In a sense, weakness is Demian's own shadow. He has a deep dislike for it. And the character who embodies that weakness more than anyone else is Sinclair. You could almost say that Sinclair speaks for the weak. He's portrayed as an extremely vulnerable person. So perhaps, when Demian recognizes that mark in Sinclair, what he's really seeing is the weakness within himself, the very shadow he doesn't want to acknowledge. Maybe that's why he draws Sinclair into his life. Perhaps he wants to embrace that hidden part of himself. But in the end, he never truly understands Sinclair. There's a scene where Sinclair, lost and wandering, meets Demian again. The two begin talking. Sinclair says, "How about we grab a drink?" Demian replies, "So, you drink now?" Sinclair tries to act tough. "Why not? What's wrong with that?" Of course, Demian sees right through him. He knows Sinclair is only pretending to be stronger than he really is. As they continue talking, Sinclair starts saying rather reckless things. "So what if I live like this? There's nothing wrong with it." Demian responds, "I don't know what you're so angry about, but the only person who can truly understand you is yourself." He goes on to comfort Sinclair, saying, At first, living this way may feel better than simply drifting through an ordinary life without any purpose. But eventually, Demian leaves him behind. He has nothing more to say. In other words, he can't bear to watch Sinclair's vulnerability or his attempts to hide it by acting tough. He doesn't embrace that weakness. In fact, it's the very thing Demian dislikes the most. For Sinclair, his greatest challenge has always been overcoming that vulnerable side of himself. Through Demian, Pistorius, and Frau Eva, he certainly becomes stronger, but he never becomes as strong as Demian. Will Sinclair ever be able to embrace his own shadow, his memories of Cromer, and the weakness within himself? That's what concerns me the most. The novel never really gives us an answer. It leaves us without a clear clue as to whether he ever will. That's why I can't help wondering, isn't Sinclair in a rather dangerous position? Think about it for a moment. A young man who desperately wanted to understand his inner self. Someone searching for his true identity. Someone who deeply loved art. Do you think I'm describing Sinclair? No. I'm talking about Hitler. In some ways, Hitler had a background similar to Sinclair's. Carl Jung analyzed Hitler in this way. He believed Hitler was a man who never overcame his own shadow. So doesn't that make Sinclair's situation seem rather dangerous? If there had ever been a sequel to Demian, it probably would have been called Sinclair. I've often wondered what such a story might have looked like, but there is no sequel. So what became of Sinclair? What do you think? Did Sinclair eventually integrate his shadow, go through the process of individuation, and become a truly mature person? Or did he remain someone who continued struggling with himself? When we close the final page of Demian, can we really say, now I understand what the growth of consciousness looks like? Now I understand what true growth is. Can we close the book with that sense of certainty? I don't think so. Personally, I was left with a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that something still wasn't resolved. That, to me, is the lasting impression Demian leaves behind. So, what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.